The old iron safe didn't scare the veteran, but the key waiting in his pocket did. A heavy iron lid groans open beneath the rotting kitchen floor as cold air spills into the room. The German Shepherd suddenly freezes, ears locked on the front door, while slow footsteps crunch across the gravel outside. Someone else knows what's hidden here, but who reached the cottage first? Before we begin, where are you watching from today? The first thing Jack Sullivan checked every morning wasn't the weather. It was the silence. He sat upright in the driver's seat of his faded blue pickup before sunrise, listening. Wind through lodgepole pines. A raven somewhere across the valley. The slow breathing of the German Shepherd curled across the passenger seat. No footsteps, no engines, no sudden metallic snap. Only then did his shoulders loosen. Atlas lifted his head, amber eyes meeting Jack's. The old dog stretched carefully before pressing his nose against Jack's hand. Jack scratched behind his ears without saying a word. The truck had been their home for almost 8 months. A small camping stove rested in the bed beneath a weathered tarp. 2 army duffel bags held everything Jack still owned. One carried clothes patched more than once. The other contained photographs, military medals he never displayed, and a folded American flag from his wife's funeral. He looked at the flag every morning. He never unfolded it. At 68, Jack moved slower than he once had, but habit remained stronger than age. He slipped on his boots, scanned the tree line before opening the truck door, then stepped into the crisp Montana air. Atlas immediately circled the small clearing, nose low to the ground. Clear. Jack almost smiled. Old ranger habits never disappeared. You observed before moving. You checked your surroundings before relaxing. Even after all these years, his mind quietly divided every unfamiliar place into sectors. His wife, Carol, used to laugh whenever they stopped at roadside diners. "You've already found every exit before we've even ordered coffee." She had never understood that some habits weren't choices anymore. They simply became part of breathing. Jack poured coffee into a dented metal cup, while Atlas watched a pair of mule deer disappear into the timber. Far away, thunder rolled across the mountains. His hand froze. For one sharp heartbeat, the dark clouds became black smoke. The rumble became an armored convoy. Heat, dust, radio chatter, possible contact east of the canal. Jack blinked. The coffee trembled inside the cup. Atlas quietly leaned against his leg until the memory dissolved like mist beneath morning sunlight. "Thanks, partner," Jack whispered. The dog wagged his tail exactly once. That afternoon, an unfamiliar pickup climbed the gravel road toward the campground. A young man stepped out carrying a large envelope. "Jack Sullivan?" Jack nodded. "I'm looking for you. Attorney Rachel Mercer asked me to deliver this." Jack frowned. He hadn't spoken to a lawyer in years. Inside the envelope sat a formal letter requesting his presence at the reading of Elias Boone's will in Hamilton the following morning. Jack read the name twice. Elias, the old rancher. 5 winters earlier, Jack had found him stranded during a whiteout high in the Bitterroot Mountains. Elias's truck had slid into a drift. His radio battery had died. Temperatures had dropped below 0 before sunset. Jack had spotted faint exhaust drifting above the snow while cutting through an abandoned logging road. It had taken nearly 3 hours to dig the truck free. Elias insisted they share coffee afterward inside his ranch house. That coffee somehow turned into years of friendship. They rarely talked about personal matters. They fixed fences, cut firewood, repaired old equipment. Sometimes they simply watched the mountains in comfortable silence. Jack never accepted payment. Elias never stopped inviting him back. Now he was gone. The funeral had happened 3 days earlier. Jack hadn't attended. He couldn't afford the gasoline. The next morning, after washing up at a roadside rest stop, Jack parked outside Mercer Legal Services. Atlas waited quietly in the truck. The receptionist smiled politely. "Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Mercer is expecting you." Inside the conference room sat several sharply dressed men and women. Expensive watches, pressed jackets, perfect smiles that disappeared the moment Jack entered. Across the table, a tall man in his early 50s barely looked up from his phone. Grant Boone, Elias's eldest son. Jack recognized him from the ranch. He had visited only twice in 5 years. Rachel Mercer entered carrying a thick leather folder. She offered Jack a warm handshake. "I'm glad you came." Grant rolled his eyes. "Can we get this over with?" Rachel opened the will. Her calm voice filled the room. "To my children, Grant Boone and Melissa Boone," she carefully listed the inheritance. The main ranch, nearly 2,000 acres, cattle, farm equipment, investment accounts, vehicles, business holdings. Grant smiled wider with every sentence. Melissa quietly nodded in satisfaction. Jack listened without expectation. He had never imagined Elias leaving him anything. Finally, Rachel turned one page. "And to my friend, Jack Sullivan." Every eye shifted toward him. Jack straightened instinctively. "I offer ownership of the East Caretaker Cottage and its surrounding parcel, contingent upon a purchase price of exactly $1 US. Silence. Then laughter. Grant leaned back in his chair. $1? Melissa covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Grant failed entirely. "The old shack?" He shook his head. "That's perfect." Rachel ignored him. "The transfer is completely legal if accepted today." Jack remained still. He remembered the little stone cottage tucked high against the mountain ridge. Even 20 years ago, it had looked abandoned. Grant smirked. "Save yourself the trouble, old man. That place barely has walls." Jack looked at Rachel. "Did Elias leave any reason?" Rachel slid a weathered deed across the table. No explanation. Attached to the deed by a faded leather cord hung an old brass key, darkened with age. Jack reached for it. The metal felt unexpectedly heavy. Behind the office window, Atlas suddenly stood inside the truck. His ears pointed forward. His eyes never left the brass key resting in Jack's hand. Jack noticed. For just a second, so did Rachel. Her eyes lingered on Atlas standing motionless inside the truck, then returned to the old brass key in Jack's weathered hand. Something almost crossed her face, recognition perhaps, but it disappeared before Jack could place it. "The transfer must be completed today," she said quietly, "if you wish to accept." Grant Boone laughed again, louder this time. "You've got to be kidding. That dump isn't worth the weeds growing through the porch." Melissa folded her arms. Dad always refused to tear it down. Nobody ever understood why. Jack rubbed the edge of the key with his thumb. It felt unusually warm despite the cool office. "I'll take it." Grant smirked. "Of course you will." Jack reached into his faded wallet. There wasn't much inside. A driver's license. One photograph of Carol smiling beside an old hay wagon. 3 folded $20 bills. A few singles. He carefully pulled out a single $1 bill, flattened its creases against the polished conference table, and slid it toward Rachel. She accepted it without ceremony. "The East Caretaker Cottage is now legally yours, Mr. Sullivan." Grant chuckled as everyone stood. "Congratulations." He paused beside Jack. "You just bought yourself the biggest headache in Montana." Jack said nothing. Years in uniform had taught him something valuable. The loudest man in the room usually revealed the most. Outside, Atlas greeted him with a soft whine. Jack clipped the old brass key onto his own key ring. The dog sniffed it once before looking toward the western mountains. His ears stayed forward, as though listening for something far away. The drive took nearly 3 hours. The paved highway gradually surrendered to gravel roads that wound through towering lodgepole pine forests and open valleys where abandoned fences leaned beneath years of snow and wind. Jack drove slowly. The truck protested every steep climb. Atlas rested with his head near the open window, breathing in the mountain air. By late afternoon, they reached Boone Ranch, or rather, what remained of it. The main ranch house stood proudly across rolling pasture land. Fresh paint, new fencing, brand new tractors already lined the equipment barn. Grant clearly hadn't wasted time celebrating his inheritance. Jack continued another mile up an overgrown logging road. Branches scraped against both sides of the truck. Eventually, the forest opened. The cottage waited alone beneath enormous ponderosa pines. Silence surrounded it. The stone walls still stood firm, but nature had reclaimed nearly everything else. Half the cedar-shingled roof had collapsed. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side. The chimney leaned just enough to make Jack instinctively calculate where it would fall if winter snow became too heavy. Broken windows stared like empty eyes. Atlas jumped out first. Instead of charging ahead, he slowly circled the building. Once, twice, nose low, tail level, working. Jack recognized the behavior immediately. The dog wasn't exploring, he was clearing. Satisfied at last, Atlas returned and quietly sat beside the front steps. Jack smiled. "Guess we're home." The old brass key slid into the weathered lock without resistance. The door groaned inward. Dust drifted through shafts of evening sunlight. Jack didn't step inside. Not immediately. Old habits. He studied every corner from the doorway. Collapsed ceiling. No visible movement. No fresh footprints. One broken staircase. An old wood stove. Then he entered. Each boot landed carefully. Years ago, his ranger team had cleared abandoned compounds overseas one room at a time. The motions returned automatically. Corners first, doorways second, windows third. Only after every room had been checked did Jack finally lower his shoulders. Atlas wandered quietly from room to room before stopping beside the cold stone fireplace. He lay down. Decision made. The cottage smelled of old pine boards, damp earth, and forgotten winters. Jack opened every surviving window. Cold mountain air pushed years of stale dust outside. He spent the next 2 hours dragging broken furniture onto the porch. An old rocking chair, collapsed cabinets, waterlogged mattresses. Every trip ended the same way. Atlas followed close behind, never more than a few feet away. As sunset painted the mountains copper and gold, Jack unfolded his sleeping bag beside the fireplace. The roof above still held over this one corner. Barely. Dinner consisted of canned stew warmed over a small camp stove. Atlas received half without complaint. Darkness settled quickly. Outside, coyotes called somewhere across the valley. The sound carried through the trees. Jack closed his eyes. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then lightning exploded across the sky. The thunder followed almost instantly. The blast echoed through the mountains. Jack's body reacted before his mind. He rolled sideways off the sleeping bag. One hand searched for a rifle that wasn't there. His breathing shortened. Concrete walls. Burning diesel. A convoy stalled beside a shattered bridge. Someone yelling for a medic. Another flash. Atlas immediately crossed the room and pressed his full weight against Jack's shoulder. The dog didn't bark, didn't panic. He simply stayed there until the storm became nothing more than rain striking the broken roof. Jack slowly exhaled. "I'm here." He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Atlas or reminding himself. Much later, long after midnight, the rain stopped. Jack remained awake. Old soldiers learned that silence could change without warning. Somewhere beyond the trees, a vehicle door quietly closed. Atlas's head lifted instantly, his ears locked toward the darkness outside. Neither of them moved. Jack reached over without looking and switched off the lantern. The cottage fell into darkness. Rainwater still dripped through a crack in the roof, tapping steadily into an old metal bucket. Everything else was silent. Atlas remained perfectly still. His breathing slowed. His eyes never left the front window. Jack had learned long ago to trust the dog before trusting his own instincts. In Afghanistan, Atlas's predecessor, another military shepherd named Ranger, had once frozen beside a dry riverbed seconds before an ambush. Jack never forgot the lesson. Dogs noticed what people explained away. 5 long minutes passed. Finally, headlights swept briefly through the pine trunks outside before disappearing farther down the mountain road. Not toward the cottage. Away from it. Only then did Atlas lower his head. Jack never went back to sleep. Morning arrived cold and bright. Frost covered the meadow surrounding the cottage. Jack brewed coffee while Atlas made another slow circle around the property. This time the dog paused near the old split-rail fence. Fresh tire tracks. They hadn't been there yesterday. Jack crouched beside them. Wide tread. Heavy SUV. Recently made. He looked toward the ridge overlooking the valley. Someone had driven up during the night. Not by accident. He quietly memorized the pattern before covering the tracks with loose pine needles. Old habits. Never advertise what you know. The morning passed repairing broken shutters salvaged from an old woodshed behind the cottage. Most of the lumber was still usable after a little trimming. By noon, the sound of engines echoed through the valley. Atlas noticed them first. His ears lifted. Then came the dust cloud. 3 expensive black SUVs rolled slowly toward the cottage. Jack wiped his hands on an old work shirt and waited. The first vehicle stopped. Grant Boone climbed out wearing polished boots that immediately collected mud. 2 men followed carrying rolled surveying maps. Another wore a bright orange safety vest. Grant looked around with obvious disgust. "I can't believe you're actually staying here." Jack rested one hand on the handle of his hammer. "I am." Grant smiled politely, though nothing about his eyes softened. "I've been thinking." He opened a leather folder. "I'll make this easy." He removed a cashier's check. $25,000. "You paid $1. Grant extended the check. "I'm offering $25,000. Jack didn't even glance at it. "No." Grant laughed. "You didn't even hear the rest." "I heard enough." One of the surveyors exchanged an uneasy look with the other. Grant folded the check again. "You don't understand. My family wants to clean this place up. It already belongs to me. It's a collapsing cabin. It still belongs to me." Grant's smile disappeared. Atlas quietly stepped forward until he stood beside Jack's knee. The shepherd never growled. He simply watched. Grant noticed. "I could double it." "No." $50,000. Jack shook his head once. Grant looked genuinely confused. "You've been living in a truck?" Jack nodded. "You could buy another house." "I already did." Grant stared at the broken cottage behind him. "This?" Jack looked toward the mountains. "It's enough." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Wind stirred through the tall pines. Finally, Grant slipped the check back inside the folder. "You know," his voice hardened, "my father wasn't thinking clearly near the end." Jack answered calmly. "He seemed perfectly clear to me." Grant's jaw tightened. "We're bringing in developers." "So?" "They need access through this parcel." They can build around it. Grant stepped closer. No, they can. No, Jack. For the first time, annoyance cracked through Grant's polished manners. This little piece of land is in the way. Jack studied him carefully. That sentence bothered him, not because of what Grant said, because of what he didn't. If access were the real problem, Grant would negotiate easements. Instead, he wanted ownership, only ownership. Jack filed the thought away. Grant turned sharply. Let's go. The convoy disappeared back down the mountain road. Atlas continued watching until every vehicle vanished. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a formal written offer. $100,000. Jack folded it neatly, then placed it unopened beneath the coffee pot. The following morning, his small gasoline can was empty. Someone had siphoned every drop overnight. The day after that, 2 fence posts had been cut clean through with a saw. Not broken. Cut. Jack examined the smooth edges. Professional. Intentional. Atlas sniffed both posts before walking several yards into the woods. He stopped beside an old pine. Jack looked up. Fresh boot prints. Someone had stood there recently, watching the cottage, watching him. Jack slowly scanned the surrounding ridgeline the way he once searched distant rooftops overseas. Nothing moved, but the feeling remained. They weren't trying to scare him away anymore. They were studying him. As evening settled over the valley, Atlas walked to the edge of the tree line and faced the forest. A low rumble rose from deep inside his chest. Not loud, not frightened. A warning. Jack quietly closed the cabin door. Then, without turning on a single light, he reached for the old brass key hanging beside the deed. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly felt that Elias Boone had expected all of this. Jack slept lightly that night. Not because of the cold, because something about the old rancher's silence inside the lawyer's office lingered in his thoughts. Elias had left no letter, no explanation. Just a brass key attached to the deed of a cottage everyone else considered worthless. That wasn't the way Elias handled things. By dawn, the mountain air carried the sharp scent of wet pine and fresh earth. Thin fog drifted between the trees, wrapping the valley in pale gray ribbons. Jack stepped outside with his coffee. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd wasn't waiting beside the porch as usual. He stood near the kitchen wall, staring at the ground beneath one broken window. Jack watched him for nearly a minute. The dog never moved. What is it? Atlas scratched the dirt once. Then again. Not excited, not frantic, deliberate. Jack walked over. The earth looked ordinary. No fresh holes, no animal tracks, no scent he could recognize. Atlas looked at him, then scratched again. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe there's an old squirrel down there. The dog ignored him. The next 3 days settled into a quiet routine. Jack repaired loose shingles salvaged from an abandoned woodshed. He patched broken stonework around the chimney. He cleaned decades of soot from the fireplace until the original river rock finally appeared beneath the grime. The work exhausted him, but it felt good. Every repaired board reminded him of rebuilding small schools after deployments overseas. Simple work that somehow helped quiet louder memories. At night, those memories still returned. A slammed cabinet became distant mortar fire. A gust of wind through cracked windows became rotor blades circling above an Iraqi village. He would wake before dawn, already sitting upright before realizing he wasn't wearing body armor anymore. Each time, Atlas was there. Sometimes the dog rested his head against Jack's knee. Sometimes he simply remained close enough that Jack could hear him breathing. Nothing else was needed. On the 4th afternoon, Jack finally began replacing the kitchen floor. The old pine boards had absorbed years of moisture. Several crumbled beneath his boots. He removed them one by one using an old pry bar and stacked the rotten lumber outside. Atlas watched every movement, until suddenly, the dog rushed across the room. He planted himself to one corner near the pantry. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jack barely looked up. Hold on. Atlas scratched harder. His nails scraped rapidly across the exposed planks. Jack frowned. There isn't anything alive under there. The shepherd refused to move. Jack pointed toward the doorway. Outside. Atlas remained exactly where he was. That alone caught Jack's attention. Military dogs were trained to obey. Atlas had long since retired from service, but discipline remained part of him. If he ignored a command, he believed something mattered more. Jack slowly walked over. The floor looked no different from the rest. Still, he trusted the dog. He slid the pry bar beneath another warped plank. The old wood split apart easily. Atlas immediately lowered his nose into the opening, then stepped back, waiting. Jack widened the hole. Another board came free, then another. Finally, only one heavy section remained. He wedged the pry bar beneath it and leaned his weight against the handle. The board snapped upward, instead of striking soft earth beneath the cabin. Clang! The shock traveled straight through the iron bar into Jack's shoulders. Metal. Solid. He froze. Atlas took one cautious step backward. Jack knelt, carefully brushing away decades of packed dirt, mouse nests, and splintered wood. Slowly, dark steel emerged beneath the debris. Not a pipe, not an old stove, a flat sheet of thick iron, perfectly square. Jack's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Training. Slow was smooth. Smooth was fast. He forced himself to stop digging. Instead, he stood. Atlas watched him quietly. Jack picked up the flashlight hanging from his tool belt. Without another word, he began clearing the cottage. Every room, every window, every doorway. He checked beneath the porch, around the woodshed, along the tree line. He paused twice, scanning the ridgeline through a pair of old binoculars he kept inside the truck. Nothing moved. No vehicles. No strangers. No fresh tracks. Satisfied, he returned inside. Atlas was still sitting exactly where Jack had left him, guarding the opening. Jack resumed removing boards, one by one. Nearly an hour later, the entire object lay exposed. It wasn't simply metal buried beneath the floor. It was an enormous iron safe built directly into the stone foundation of the cottage, nearly 4 feet across. Its edges disappeared beneath carefully fitted granite blocks. Whoever installed it had intended it to remain there forever. No combination dial, no handle, only a single antique keyhole made of polished brass, almost untouched by rust despite the passing decades. Jack reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the old brass key Rachel Mercer had handed him days earlier. He held it beside the lock. The size matched perfectly. Atlas looked from the key to the safe, then quietly sat beside Jack, his tail resting against the dusty floor. Outside, a cold wind stirred through the pines. Inside the silent cottage, Jack slowly lifted the key toward the waiting lock. The old brass slid into the keyhole as though it had never belonged anywhere else. He stopped. Years of military training had taught him one final habit before opening anything unknown. Listen. The cottage settled around him with quiet creaks. Wind whispered through broken shingles. Somewhere outside, a woodpecker tapped against a dead pine. Nothing else. Jack wrapped his fingers around the key and turned it. At first, nothing happened. Then, a deep metallic click echoed beneath the floor. Not loud, heavy, purposeful. Atlas's ears twitched, but instead of retreating, The German Shepherd stepped closer until his shoulder touched Jack's arm. The safe wasn't spring-loaded. It had been built before the convenience mattered. Jack slipped the pry bar beneath the thick iron lid and leaned his weight into it. Rust groaned. Dust drifted upward. Slowly, the lid rose. Cold air escaped from the dark compartment below. Not stale. Dry. Preserved. Jack aimed his flashlight inside. He blinked. There was no gold, no stacks of cash, no glittering treasure. Instead, every item had been arranged with remarkable care. Leather-bound journals rested in neat rows. Several rolled survey maps were secured with faded blue ribbons. A weatherproof steel tube held folded engineering drawings. Bundles of legal documents were tied with waxed cord. Old black and white aerial photographs showed the surrounding mountains from decades earlier. Everything had been organized by someone who expected another person to find it someday. Atlas lowered his nose toward the opening. He sniffed once, then quietly backed away, as though he understood this place belonged to memory more than scent. Jack carefully removed the top journal. The leather cover had cracked with age, but the pages inside remained perfectly dry. Inside the front cover, neat handwriting identified the owner. Elias Boone. Jack turned several pages. Most entries weren't personal. They recorded measurements, property markers, weather observations, dates, small sketches of ridgelines. Occasionally, Elias added brief notes, checked boundary after spring thaw, old survey markers still intact. Do not trust county copy. Jack frowned. The entries read more like field reports than a diary. Beneath the journals rested a thick manila envelope. Across the front, written in dark blue ink, were 4 simple words. For Jack Sullivan. His chest tightened. He sat cross-legged beside the safe before opening it. Inside lay several folded pages. The first began in Elias's familiar handwriting. Jack, if you're reading this, then you ignored the laughter. I hoped you would. You always looked past appearances. Most people never do. If Grant owns this cottage, burn every paper inside this safe. If you own it, keep reading. Jack swallowed. Outside, clouds drifted across the afternoon sun, dimming the light filtering through the broken windows. He continued. This cottage was never important because of its walls. People believed that for generations. They were wrong. Everything that truly matters begins beneath it. Jack lowered the page. His eyes drifted toward the survey map still lying inside the safe. What were you protecting? He whispered. Atlas suddenly stood. His head snapped toward the front door. Every muscle tightened. A low growl rolled quietly from his chest. Jack immediately folded the letter. The movement happened automatically. Documents returned to the safe, flashlight off. He listened. Crunch. Someone stepped on gravel outside. Not an animal. Too measured. Crunch. Another footstep. Jack motioned silently. Atlas moved without hesitation, positioning himself beside the doorway but remaining out of sight. Jack eased toward the nearest window, careful to avoid loose floorboards. From the narrow gap between warped shutters, he scanned the yard. Nothing. Only tall grass moving in the breeze. Another sound. This time behind the cottage. A vehicle door closed. Softly. Jack's breathing slowed. His mind mapped the terrain exactly as it had years before. One approach from the driveway. One through the woods. One blindside behind the old woodshed. Atlas shifted again. Still silent. Still waiting. Jack reached for the binoculars hanging beside the window. As he focused on the trees beyond the woodshed, a flash of reflected sunlight disappeared behind a pine trunk. Glass. Someone had been watching the cottage. The figure vanished before Jack could identify who it was. Seconds later, an engine started somewhere beyond the ridge. The vehicle pulled away without ever coming into view. Silence returned. Jack remained at the window another full minute before lowering the binoculars. Atlas relaxed, though he continued staring toward the forest. Jack looked back at the open safe, then at Elias's unfinished letter. Whatever secret the old rancher had buried beneath this cottage, someone else already knew enough to keep coming back, and they were growing impatient. Jack waited until sunset before opening the safe again. He closed every curtain that still hung from its rusted rod and covered the broken windows with old canvas tarps he had found in the woodshed. Only a single battery lantern illuminated the kitchen, its soft yellow glow barely reaching the iron safe beneath the missing floorboards. Atlas settled beside the front door. Not sleeping. Watching. Jack unfolded the next pages of Elias Boone's letter. My father used to say that mountains keep their promises longer than people do. I didn't understand him until I inherited this land. Jack read slowly. Every sentence felt deliberate. When surveyors first mapped this valley after the war, they made a mistake. A small mistake on paper. One boundary marker was placed 63 feet farther east than it should have been. Nobody noticed because the caretaker's cottage had almost no value. Jack looked toward the rough stone walls surrounding him. The old place suddenly felt different, as if every board carried a secret. The ranch changed owners, fences moved, roads were built, taxes were paid, but no one ever corrected the original survey. Jack reached for one of the rolled maps. The parchment cracked softly as he spread it across the kitchen table. Red ink marked property lines. Blue pencil traced the mountain ridge. Near the bottom corner, Elias had circled one tiny parcel, the caretaker's cottage. Everything beneath it had been shaded in green. Jack compared it to a newer county survey stored beside it. The surface boundaries matched. The underground boundaries did not. He frowned. Years ago, military intelligence officers had taught him to compare aerial photographs with updated terrain maps, looking for the smallest inconsistency. Most people searched for what had changed. Professionals searched for what hadn't. He placed the maps side by side. The old mineral survey extended beneath nearly the entire western ridge. The legal ownership line followed the forgotten boundary from decades earlier. Not the ranch. The cottage. Jack leaned back slowly. No. He whispered the word to the empty room. Elias hadn't hidden money. He had hidden ownership. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Jack paused. The dog wasn't alarmed, just listening. Jack continued reading. I confirmed the discovery 42 years ago. Geologists identified one of the largest untouched deposits of rare industrial minerals in this part of Montana. They offered to buy everything. Jack opened another folder. Inside were engineering reports stamped by federal agencies, laboratory results, core samples, environmental studies. Everything had been professionally documented. Elias had never sold. Instead, he quietly renewed every filing exactly when required. Another page waited beneath them. If my children ever discover this, they will strip these mountains bare before the first snowfall. They see land as profit. You see it as home. Jack stopped reading. His throat tightened. He remembered Elias standing beside a broken fence one autumn evening. We borrow land, the old rancher had said while repairing cedar posts. We never really own it. Jack hadn't understood then. Now he did. The next document carried official state seals, property rights assignment, original filing, amended recording, successive renewal. Every signature had been witnessed, every filing perfectly legal. The final page contained only one sentence. The underground rights belong forever to whoever legally owns the East Caretaker Cottage. Jack stared at the words. Grant Boone had inherited thousands of acres, yet the single acre everyone mocked controlled everything beneath the western mountain. Atlas rose quietly and walked toward the open doorway. The dog sniffed the cool night air, then turned back, satisfied. Jack folded the papers carefully. His ranger training told him something else now. Information created danger. The fewer people who knew, the longer they survived. He wrapped the documents inside waterproof canvas before returning them to the safe. Only one map remained outside, the oldest one. As he rolled it closed, something slipped from inside the tube, a narrow strip of yellowed paper. Handwritten coordinates, not to the mineral deposit, to an old survey marker high above the cottage. Beside the coordinates, Elias had written only 5 words. Truth begins at marker 7. Jack frowned. That location wasn't anywhere near the ranch buildings. It sat deep inside the forest above the ridge. Why would Elias leave another clue if everything had already been explained? Atlas suddenly gave one sharp bark. Jack extinguished the lantern immediately. Outside, headlights swept silently across the distant treetops. This time they weren't passing the cottage. They were climbing toward it. Jack stayed perfectly still until the headlights disappeared behind a stand of tall pines. The engine shut off. A truck door slammed, then another. Atlas stood without a sound. The dog's posture told Jack everything. More than one person. Moving carefully. Not lost hikers. Jack slipped the brass key and Elias's documents into a weatherproof pouch and lowered them back into the iron safe. He closed the heavy lid, brushed loose dust across the seams, and laid 2 floorboards over the opening without fastening them. From a distance, the kitchen looked untouched. He killed every remaining light. Outside, voices drifted through the trees. County order. Sunrise. Get measurements. Jack eased toward the side window, keeping below the sill. He risked one quick glance. 3 pickup trucks, a yellow bulldozer on a trailer, 2 men wearing reflective construction jackets, 4 others in dark clothing. Grant Boone stepped from the lead truck, shining a flashlight toward the cottage. "They're still here," one man muttered. "They won't be tomorrow," Grant answered. Jack quietly memorized faces, vehicles, and license plates. Old ranger instincts returned as naturally as breathing. Observe first, react second. Emotion came last. Atlas looked toward the back of the cottage, not the front. Jack followed the dog's eyes. Movement. Someone had split off from the others and disappeared around the rear wall, flanking. The realization came instantly. Grant wasn't simply trying to intimidate him. Someone intended to enter from behind while everyone watched the front. Jack motioned with 2 fingers. Atlas understood. The shepherd slipped silently into the darkness of the hallway. Jack circled toward the rear room, avoiding the loose floorboards he had already memorized. Every step landed exactly where the old beams remained strongest. A branch snapped outside, then another. The back door handle moved, slowly. Someone tested it. The latch held. Jack remained motionless. The handle stopped moving. Silence. Then came the sound of boots against the porch. Atlas's ears flattened. A shadow appeared beneath the gap at the bottom of the door. Jack reached for his phone. Without speaking, he activated the camera and began recording. The back window suddenly rattled. Someone tried lifting it. Atlas exploded forward. His bark shattered the silence. The figure outside stumbled backward with a curse. Another man shouted from the front yard. "What happened?" "I found the dog." Jack stepped into view inside the cabin, keeping the locked door between himself and the intruder. "You're on private property," he called evenly. "Everything happening outside this house is being recorded." The voices stopped. Grant rounded the corner carrying a flashlight. "We're conducting a preliminary inspection." At 10 o'clock at night? Grant's smile never reached his eyes. "We're preparing for tomorrow." Preparing for what? "The county condemned this structure this afternoon." Jack frowned. "I haven't received any notice." "You will." Grant held up a folded document but remained too far away for Jack to read it. "By sunrise, this place comes down," Jack answered calmly. "Then you'll have no objection to waiting until daylight while I verify the paperwork." Grant's jaw tightened. Behind him, one of the dark-clothed men quietly drifted farther into the shadows. Atlas noticed first. The shepherd turned sharply and growled. The man froze. Jack shifted his attention for only an instant. That was enough. The stranger rushed toward the side of the cottage. A metallic scraping sound echoed beneath the kitchen floor. He was trying to pry up the loose boards from outside through the crawlspace vent. He knew exactly where to look. Jack sprinted through the kitchen. Atlas reached the side door first. The dog burst outside just as the man crawled beneath the foundation. "Atlas!" The shepherd lunged. A cry echoed beneath the cabin. Then came a sharp yelp that froze Jack where he stood. Atlas backed out from under the foundation, limping heavily. A long cut ran across his right shoulder. Dark blood soaked his tan fur. The man who had slashed him scrambled free on the opposite side and disappeared into the trees. Grant shouted, "Get back to the trucks!" Within seconds, engines roared to life. The convoy retreated down the mountain road, leaving only drifting dust and silence behind. Jack dropped to one knee beside Atlas. The old ranger's hands became steady, calm, methodical. He pressed clean gauze from his first aid kit against the wound while speaking in the same quiet voice he had once used with injured soldiers. "Easy, partner. Stay with me." Atlas never whimpered. He simply looked at Jack, breathing hard but holding still. The cut was deep, but it had narrowly missed the shoulder joint. Jack wrapped the bandage firmly. Only then did he notice something lying near the crawlspace entrance. During the struggle, the fleeing intruder had dropped a laminated identification badge. Jack picked it up with careful fingers. The logo belonged to a private demolition contractor. The authorization signature at the bottom carried one familiar name: Grant Boone. Jack slipped the badge into his pocket. Tomorrow wasn't going to be about an inspection. It was going to be a fight for the cottage. And now he finally had proof. Jack barely slept. He spread a blanket beside the fireplace for Atlas and checked the bandage every hour. The cut had stopped bleeding, but the muscles around the shepherd's shoulder twitched whenever he shifted his weight. At dawn, Jack boiled water on the camp stove and cleaned the wound again. "You've carried me through enough bad days," he murmured, fastening a fresh dressing. "Now let me carry you." Atlas answered by pressing his nose against Jack's forearm. Outside, the mountains looked deceptively peaceful. Thin ribbons of fog drifted through the pines, while frost glittered across the meadow. It was hard to imagine that only hours earlier strangers had been crawling beneath the cottage. Jack slipped the demolition contractor's badge into his shirt pocket. He had evidence. He simply needed someone willing to listen. Before he could start the truck, another vehicle climbed the narrow road. A dark green SUV, not one of Grant's. Atlas lifted his head but didn't growl. The SUV stopped several yards from the porch. Rachel Mercer stepped out carrying a leather briefcase thick enough to require both hands. She looked from Jack to Atlas. "What happened?" Jack glanced at the bandaged shoulder. Someone wanted inside the crawl space. Rachel's expression hardened. "I was afraid they'd move this quickly." "You knew?" I knew Grant would panic once he realized you weren't leaving. Jack folded his arms. You'd better start explaining. Rachel nodded slowly. I owe you that. They sat on the porch while Atlas rested beside Jack's boots. Rachel removed several thick folders secured with blue ribbons. Each carried official seals from state and federal agencies. I couldn't give you these at the reading of the will, she said. Elias left very specific instructions. She handed Jack a notarized letter. Across the top were Elias's unmistakable initials. If Jack Sullivan accepts ownership willingly and without bargaining, deliver the enclosed documents only after the property comes under direct threat. Jack looked up. He knew this would happen. Rachel gave a sad smile. He knew Grant. Jack opened the file. Inside were mineral surveys, environmental assessments, mortgage records, and legal opinions spanning nearly 30 years. Rachel pointed to one document. Grant thinks he inherited a fortune. He did. No. She slid another paper across the porch table. He inherited the surface. Jack frowned. The ranch carries 3 major development loans. Elias borrowed heavily over the past decade. Jack looked surprised. For what? Rachel tapped another folder. To preserve the mountain. She unfolded a geological survey. Colored layers ran beneath the western ridge exactly where Elias's old maps had shown them. The mineral rights are worth far more than the ranch itself. Jack nodded. I've read that part. Rachel smiled faintly. Not all of it. She removed one final document. This amendment was recorded 17 years ago. Jack read silently. His eyes stopped halfway down the page. The legal description permanently separated the underground mineral estate from every mortgage attached to Boone Ranch. Only one parcel remained exempt. The East Caretaker Cottage. Rachel folded her hands. The banks can claim the ranch. They can't touch this. Jack looked toward the cottage. They never could. She nodded. Elias protected it before Grant even understood why. Jack leaned back slowly. So Grant inherited millions in debt. More than that. Rachel opened another ledger. Environmental restoration obligations. Road maintenance agreements. Equipment financing. She looked directly at Jack. Without the mineral rights, the ranch barely breaks even. Jack whistled softly. Elias left him the bills. He left him exactly what he valued. Silence settled over the porch. Wind stirred through the tall grass. Atlas opened one eye, watching Rachel carefully before relaxing again. Jack studied the documents. Elias planned this for years, for decades. Rachel hesitated. There's something else. She reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed envelope marked with today's date. My instructions were to give you this only after someone attempted to force you off the property. Jack broke the seal. Inside was another handwritten note. Jack, if you're reading this, then they finally showed you who they truly are. Do not sell. Do not surrender. Most importantly, do not let anyone convince you this is about money. The mountain belongs to the people who respect it. Protect it. Rachel quietly said, He trusted your character more than anyone else's. Jack folded the note with careful hands. I don't know the first thing about mineral rights. You don't need to. She closed the briefcase. I do. Before Jack could answer, the distant rumble of diesel engines echoed across the valley. Both of them turned. Several dust clouds rose along the mountain road. More vehicles than before. Atlas struggled to his feet despite the injured shoulder. His ears locked forward. Rachel looked toward the approaching convoy. They're not coming to negotiate anymore. Jack slipped Elias's letter into his jacket. No. His eyes followed the bulldozer climbing steadily toward the cottage. "They're coming to take it." The convoy stopped 50 yards from the porch. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight as engines idled. Grant Boone climbed out first. He wore pressed jeans, polished boots, and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the cottage like it was already gone. Behind him stood 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office. A building inspector stepped from another truck, carrying a clipboard. The bulldozer remained on its trailer. Waiting. Grant smiled. "Morning, Jack." Jack stayed on the porch beside Atlas. Rachel stood quietly at his side, briefcase in hand. "What do you want?" Jack asked. Grant spread his arms, just following county orders. The inspector approached carefully. "I've received a complaint regarding structural safety. We need to inspect the building." Rachel stepped forward before Jack could answer. "My client has no objection to a lawful inspection." She paused. "But no demolition will occur today." Grant's smile faded. "We'll see." The inspector spent nearly an hour inside the cottage. He measured foundation stones, examined roof beams, checked electrical wiring. Jack watched from outside while Atlas rested beside him, favoring his injured shoulder, but refusing to lie down. Finally, the inspector returned. "This structure requires repairs," he said. Grant nodded impatiently. "So condemn it." The inspector looked confused. "I didn't say that." Grant's jaw tightened. "The foundation is old." "It is. The roof leaks." "Yes, but the building is stable." He closed his clipboard. "It doesn't meet modern code, but it's not unsafe enough to order immediate demolition." Rachel smiled for the first time that morning. "Thank you." Grant stared at the inspector. "You've got to be kidding. I'm giving the owner 90 days to complete repairs." Grant said nothing. He climbed back into his truck with enough force to slam the door. One by one, the county vehicles turned around and headed down the mountain. Only Grant's pickup remained. He lowered the window. "This isn't over," Jack answered evenly. "I know." Grant drove away. The mountain became quiet again, for nearly 2 hours. Then the wind changed. Atlas lifted his head. His nose worked the air. Jack caught it a second later. Smoke. Not from a fireplace. Fresh, sharp. Rachel looked toward the western ridge. A thin gray ribbon rose above the treetops. "Do you burn brush up here?" she asked. Jack was already moving. "No." Within minutes, the ribbon became a column. Orange flickers appeared beneath the pines. The fire wasn't large, yet, but it was climbing uphill fast through dry grass left from the previous season. Jack grabbed a shovel from the woodshed. Rachel reached for her phone. "I'm calling it in." Atlas struggled to his feet. "No," Jack said gently. "You stay." The shepherd ignored him. Despite the fresh bandage, Atlas limped after Jack toward the tree line. The fire crackled louder with every step. Burning needles floated through the air like black snow. Jack reached the edge of the flames. They stretched across nearly 40 yards, racing through brush toward the cottage. Too straight, too even. His eyes narrowed. Natural fires wandered. This one formed almost a perfect line. Someone had started it deliberately. He attacked the nearest flames with the shovel, throwing dirt over burning grass. Rachel joined him moments later, beating sparks with a heavy wool blanket from her SUV. Sirens echoed faintly somewhere below the mountain. Too far away. The fire reached a fallen pine. Flames climbed the dry branches in seconds. Heat rolled across Jack's face. Atlas barked sharply. Not at the fire, beyond it. Jack looked through the smoke. For a split second, he saw a man standing between 2 trees. Dark jacket, baseball cap, watching. The figure turned and ran. Jack took 2 steps after him before stopping. The fire came first, always. He turned back just as a burning branch crashed onto the narrow trail leading toward the cottage. Atlas darted forward. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, the German shepherd seized Jack's sleeve and pulled hard. Instinct took over. Jack stumbled backward. An instant later, the flaming branch slammed into the exact spot where he had been standing. Sparks exploded around them. Rachel shouted his name. The first volunteer fire engine burst into the meadow below, siren echoing across the valley. Firefighters rushed toward the flames with hoses and tools. Within 30 minutes, the advancing fire was contained. Black smoke drifted upward through scorched timber. Jack stood silently at the burned edge of the forest. Atlas leaned against his leg, breathing hard. The fire chief walked over. "You're lucky." Jack looked across the blackened ground. No. His gaze settled on the footprints disappearing into the woods beyond the burn. We were warned. He knelt beside one patch of damp ash. Half buried beneath it lay a clear plastic fuel container with melted edges. The label had survived. It belonged to the same demolition contractor whose identification badge now rested inside Jack's pocket. Grant Boone hadn't come to destroy the cottage with paperwork. When that failed, someone had tried to let the mountain do it instead. The smell of smoke lingered over the valley for 2 days. Even after the last ember died, blackened pine trunks stood like silent witnesses above the cottage. Volunteers had saved the forest, but the fire had scarred the hillside. Jack spent every morning repairing what he could. A broken fence, scorched rain gutters, a cracked porch railing. Atlas stayed close, his shoulder healing a little more each day. The stitches held, though he still favored his right leg whenever the ground became uneven. Rachel returned on the 3rd afternoon. She carried a thick file box instead of her usual briefcase. "We're out of time," she said. Jack looked up from replacing a porch board. "What happened?" She handed him a packet stamped with the county seal. Grant Boone had filed an emergency civil action. The complaint alleged that Jack had illegally concealed valuable property belonging to the Boone estate, damaged ranch assets, and intentionally started the wildfire to interfere with lawful development. Jack read each page without speaking. Finally, he looked at Rachel. He turned everything upside down. "Exactly." She nodded. "He doesn't need to prove every accusation. He only needs enough confusion for a judge to freeze ownership until the case is resolved." Jack folded the papers. "And during that time, he pressures you to settle." Jack smiled faintly. "He still doesn't understand me." "No." Rachel looked toward the cottage. "But he understands delay. Every month this drags on costs you money." Jack couldn't argue with that. He had little savings. The cottage still needed repairs. Atlas required veterinary care. Grant knew exactly where to apply pressure. Rachel opened the file box. Fortunately, she placed several documents across the kitchen table. Elias planned for lawyers too. Inside were decades of carefully preserved records, original survey maps, certified property filings, witness affidavits, county recording receipts, even handwritten correspondence between Elias and state survey officials dating back nearly 30 years. Jack stared at the collection. He kept everything. Rachel smiled. He trusted paperwork more than promises. The hearing took place 5 days later. The county courthouse was small enough that everyone recognized everyone else. Farmers, retired teachers, local business owners. Several quietly nodded to Jack as he entered with Atlas walking calmly beside him. Grant arrived moments later, surrounded by expensive attorneys. He never looked at Jack, only at the cottage deed resting on Rachel's table. The judge entered. After brief introductions, Grant's lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, This matter concerns property intentionally concealed from the lawful heirs of Elias Boone. He spoke confidently, displayed aerial photographs, explained the fire, suggested that Jack had discovered something valuable and refused lawful inspection. Then came the surprise. Grant himself took the witness stand. My father wasn't thinking clearly during his final years. Rachel remained perfectly still. Grant continued. He barely remembered signing legal documents. Jack felt several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Grant wasn't only challenging Jack, he was questioning his own father's competence. Rachel finally stood. Permission to cross-examine. The judge nodded. She approached Grant carrying only a single folder. Mr. Boone. Yes? You testified your father suffered memory problems. Correct. You also testified he forgot important legal matters. Yes. Rachel opened the folder. Then perhaps you can explain why your father renewed the mineral rights filings every 5 years. She placed one certified document before him, without missing a single deadline. Another document, for 27 consecutive years. Another, using identical legal descriptions. Another, each witnessed by licensed county officials. The courtroom became silent. Grant hesitated. Rachel continued. Would you also explain why your father personally corrected 3 surveying errors made by the county? She held up another certified filing. Errors that your own attorneys failed to notice until last week? Grant looked toward his lawyers. None answered. Rachel calmly walked to the judge's bench. Your Honor, opposing counsel argues Mr. Boone lacked capacity. She handed over the stack. The evidence demonstrates extraordinary attention to detail extending over nearly 3 decades. The judge spent several quiet minutes reviewing the documents. Finally, he removed his glasses. Mr. Boone. Grant straightened. This court finds no evidence that your father lacked legal capacity. Grant's shoulders sank slightly. Rachel wasn't finished. She produced one final exhibit. The demolition contractor's identification badge, recovered beside the cottage, then photographs of the melted fuel container found after the fire. Finally, Jack's nighttime video showing unidentified men approaching the cottage before the attempted break-in. Rachel spoke softly. We ask the court to consider whether this lawsuit was filed to protect property. She paused, or to conceal conduct that deserves separate investigation. The judge's expression changed. He looked directly at Grant. I am referring these materials to the county prosecutor. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Grant's face lost all color. As people slowly stood to leave, the judge called after Jack. Mr. Sullivan. Jack turned. Protect that property. The judge glanced briefly toward the evidence still covering the counsel table. I have a feeling your old friend wanted it in the right hands. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Grant. Jack quietly walked past them with Atlas at his side. For the first time since buying the cottage, the law was finally walking beside him instead of standing in his way. Jack expected to feel relieved. Instead, he felt responsible. The mountain looked the same as it had the day he arrived. Morning sunlight spilled across the meadow. The creek murmured beyond the cottonwoods. A hawk circled above the western ridge. Nothing in the landscape hinted that the ground beneath it was worth more than anyone had imagined. Jack stood on the porch with a mug of coffee. Atlas leaned against his leg, the shaved patch on his shoulder already beginning to grow back. The old dog no longer limped. Rachel pulled into the driveway just after sunrise. This time she carried no boxes, only a single envelope. It's over, she said. Jack opened it. The county had dismissed Grant's emergency claims. The mineral estate remained legally attached to the caretaker cottage. The attempted demolition and suspected arson had been referred for criminal investigation. Several of Grant's lenders had frozen additional financing, pending the outcome. Jack folded the papers quietly. So that's it? Rachel smiled. Legally? She nodded. Yes. Jack looked toward the mountains. It doesn't feel like winning. Rachel followed his gaze. Elias once told me something. She paused. Winning isn't keeping what's yours. It's deciding what you'll do with it. Jack didn't answer, because he already knew. Later that afternoon, he hiked toward the coordinates Elias had left behind. Marker 7. Atlas walked beside him through towering ponderosa pines. The trail climbed steadily until they reached an old granite survey marker half buried beneath moss. The brass cap still carried faint government markings from nearly a century earlier. Jack brushed away the dirt. Behind the stone sat a small cedar box protected beneath a flat slab of rock. Inside lay one final letter. No legal language, no maps, only Elias's handwriting. Jack, if you've come this far, then you've already discovered the truth beneath the mountain. Now let me tell you why I hid it. When the geologists came, they promised wealth. When the investors came, they promised progress. When politicians came, they promised jobs. No one asked what the mountain wanted. They saw numbers. I saw elk returning every spring. I saw children fishing this creek. I saw veterans who needed silence more than money. I kept wondering whether one person could protect all of that. I couldn't. Maybe you can. Jack lowered the page. The breeze carried the scent of pine resin across the ridge. Atlas sat quietly beside the stone marker, as if standing watch over an old friend's final request. Jack looked across the valley. The burned section of forest was already showing tiny patches of green pushing through the black earth. Life had begun returning before the ashes had cooled. He smiled. Nature understood healing better than people. A week later, Rachel met Jack at the county offices. Several conservation leaders, 2 forestry specialists, representatives from a veterans support organization. All had gathered around one long wooden table. Rachel quietly slid one final document toward Jack. You don't have to do this. I know. The mineral rights could make you one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana. I know. You've earned that. Jack looked at Atlas sleeping peacefully beneath the table, then at Elias's letter resting beside the paperwork. Slowly, he picked up the pen. He signed. Not a mining lease, not a sale, a permanent conservation trust. The mineral rights would never be developed. Income from limited surface uses, sustainable forestry, and carefully managed conservation programs would maintain the land. Part of the property would become a wilderness retreat, where disabled veterans could recover in peace, free of charge. The room remained silent until the final signature dried. Rachel wiped away a quiet tear. Elias chose well. Jack simply nodded. He gave me a home. Outside, evening sunlight painted the mountains gold. Atlas stepped onto the porch of the courthouse and looked toward the western ridge. Jack rested one hand on the dog's neck. Neither of them had arrived looking for fortune. They had only been searching for a place where they belonged. In the end, that turned out to be the greatest treasure hidden beneath the mountain. Summer arrived quietly in the valley. Wildflowers replaced the charred patches left by the fire. The creek ran clear again, carrying melted snow down through the pines. The cottage no longer looked abandoned. Fresh cedar shingles covered the roof. The porch had been rebuilt with lumber milled from fallen trees on the property. The old stone chimney stood straight once more. It was still simple, still humble, but now it felt alive. Every morning began the same way. Jack opened the front door before sunrise. Atlas stepped onto the porch first, scanning the meadow out of habit, before turning back with the calm confidence that everything was exactly as it should be. Jack smiled every time. Some routines never needed changing. The Conservation Trust officially took effect that autumn. Survey crews came, not to prepare for mining, but to mark protected boundaries. Foresters developed plans to restore the section damaged by the wildfire. Biologists documented elk trails and nesting areas that would remain untouched. The old caretaker cottage became the heart of something much larger, a place where veterans struggling to find peace could stay without charge. No uniforms, no speeches, no questions they didn't want to answer. Just mountains, silence, and time. The first guest arrived in October. His name was Daniel, a former Marine who had not slept through a full night in nearly 6 years. He barely spoke when he stepped out of his truck. Atlas walked over slowly. The German shepherd didn't bark, didn't demand attention. He simply sat beside the man. After a long moment, Daniel reached down and scratched behind Atlas's ears. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. Jack noticed. He didn't interrupt. Some conversations never needed words. Months passed. The porch welcomed more visitors. Some stayed a weekend. Others remained for weeks. They repaired fences together, planted young pine trees where the fire had passed, stalked trout in the creek, shared coffee before sunrise, laughed around evening campfires. No one was asked to explain what they carried. Everyone understood anyway. Atlas became the quiet guide through it all. He somehow knew who needed company and who needed distance. He waited beside those who woke from difficult dreams. He walked endless trails beside people who weren't ready to talk. Little by little, the mountain did what no hospital or courtroom ever could. It gave people enough silence to hear themselves again. One crisp November afternoon, Rachel arrived carrying a small wooden plaque. She smiled as Jack fastened it beside the front porch. It read, "The Elias Boone Veterans Wilderness Foundation." "Leave this place stronger than you found it." Jack stepped back. "It fits." Rachel nodded. "So did you." For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind carried golden leaves across the yard. Atlas rested peacefully in the afternoon sun. Rachel finally broke the silence. "Elias once told me he worried no one would understand why he made the choices he did." Jack looked toward the mountains. "I think he understood something most people forget." "What's that?" "We don't really inherit land." He watched a group of veterans planting young saplings along the burned hillside. "We inherit responsibility." Rachel smiled. "I wish he could see this." Jack looked toward the porch, where Atlas now greeted another arriving visitor with a gentle wag of his tail. "I think he can." Late that evening, after everyone had gone inside, Jack walked alone to the old survey marker high above the valley. The cedar box still rested beneath its stone. He placed Elias's final letter back inside, then added one of his own. It contained only a few handwritten lines. "Elias, the mountain is safe. The cottage is full again. Atlas still watches every sunrise. Thank you for trusting a tired old soldier. I'll keep the promise." Jack folded the note and returned it to the box. He replaced the stone exactly as he had found it. The stars slowly appeared above the ridge. For the first time in many years, the silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt like home. As Jack and Atlas started down the trail toward the warm lights of the cottage, the wind whispered softly through the towering pines. The mountain had kept its promise, and so had they. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just comment 1 if you believe loyalty is worth more than money, or comment 0 if you think you'd have protected the mountain too. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, second chances, and the incredible bond between people and their dogs. Please take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more unforgettable stories waiting for you, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you. Until then, thank you for watching, take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next story.